we did have to say no to some ideas. And as I noted, in particular, new programs. But we have worked to find common ground, and I am hopeful that this sets the foundation for future dialogue to happen with community members, our council, and the executive to come.
A recurring theme on this podcast, we begin with the words of Seattle City Council Budget Chair Teresa Mosqueda, who's put together a balancing package for the council after a major decline in the city's revenue. So how much authority is she wielding on the council now? And what are students at Ingram High School, scene of a terrible school shooting, saying about the council's budget as well? Plus, you thought casting a ballot just to introduce ranked choice voting was confusing. How about actually implementing it? Well, those headlines and more right here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. And I am joined by none other than, can I bring him in here? I bet you I could. Kevin Schofield, man about town, weekly columnist with the South Seattle Emerald. Kevin, so much election news to cover here, but I got to say, one of the best candidates I've seen chosen in the past week, Julio Rodriguez of the Mariners for Rookie of the Year. That was big, man.
Woohoo!
Kevin's pumping his fist, baby. Love it.
One of his jerseys is going to Cooperstown now. Already, the guy just finished his rookie year, and already one of his jerseys going to Cooperstown. I'm so happy for the guy. It's great.
That is one selection of a candidate that no one in Seattle can argue with. How about that? I love it. I love it. Well, thank you, Kevin, as always, for joining me. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Check them out on the first floor of City Hall. And if you're listening, please do become a patron of the show. At the $10 level, you can get your special edition Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mug sent to you. We'll even feature you on the show as our mugshot of the week. So this week, we send out our thanks to James and Mary, a little pre-Thanksgiving action with the turkey decoration on the mug. I see what you did there. Thank you very much for your support. And let me add some important information from Converge Media here. The Washington State Homeowner Assistance Fund, the HAF, is here for you. This is if you're behind on your payments because of some issues related to COVID. Well, that's where the HAF can help out. If you qualify, you can get up to $60,000. So give the hotline a call at 877-894-4663 or visit WashingtonHAF.org. All right, it's time for Right Here, Right Now. It's time to talk about budget rebalancing, and Budget Chair Teresa Mosqueda has been working on this after that recent news about a drop in city revenue. So she made a press announcement about her work this week, which is a little unusual, but maybe not in terms of how council member on this role. Can I ask you about this? Because our colleague Marcus Harrison Green wrote a few months ago challenging Merrill with the idea that a budget is a moral document. And Councilmember Mosqueda seems to be taking that to the next level. Before we get into some of the nitty-gritty details, how about some overall thoughts about her approach to this budget process?
Yeah, well, first of all, she has a tough task as a budget chair this year.
Yeah.
It's hard to find a way to squeeze in the council's priorities and their earmarks, right? But also adjust for the recent bad news forecast that they got, where general fund revenues are down, but what they call REIT, real estate excise tax revenues, are going to be down about $60 million, right? And that covers a lot of transportation projects, a lot of parks projects, some other infrastructure stuff. They've been using it a little bit for affordable housing projects. So none of the things, and they're not things that they want to cut, right? So where do they find the money to cover that? So, at the same time, I have to say, Mosqueda's taken an interesting approach to this because, when the balancing package was first, the notion of a balancing package, which is what she just published, was first introduced about 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. It was intended to be a shortcut where after, all the council members get a chance to, formally propose amendments, the chair finds out, okay, which ones sort of have consensus support, right? And we'll just kind of roll those into a package so that we don't have to discuss and vote on every one of them individually. We can kind of have a consensus vote and approve all that, because that's the part that we all agree upon. And then we can spend all our time focusing on the part that we don't agree on, right? But starting last year, and really in a big way this year, Councilmember Mosqueda has modified that notion, turned into kind of a platform for the budget chair to do some really significant legislating on her own. Her balancing package has 83 amendments that are sponsored by the budget chair that weren't presented or discussed in an open forum earlier in the process and have no co-sponsors.
Yeah,
right?
I
So,
noticed that just to jump in real quick, there are a bunch of these BC things
yep,
on that
yep,
budget package
yeah.
there, and that indicated budget committee as if she had talked to a number of different people, but clearly she's taken a leadership role here. And I wanted to throw on top of that, because she is the sponsor of the Jumpstart payroll tax. You remember that from a few years ago. She's really wielding some power there too, because I don't know if a lot of people want to cross her because she is the prime sponsor of that. And that payroll tax has ended up being the savior for a lot of these different programs in terms of providing extra revenue.
Yeah, you know, I think in a lot of ways it's become sort of a de facto secondary or, shadow general fund, right?
Mm,
Where, the council officially passed, a policy that says this is how we're going to spend this money. There's a bunch of one-off exceptions in the budget this year,
mm,
where Mosqueda, in some of her own balancing package, budget chair, budget committee amendments do specific
mhm.
earmarks of that money to cover specific projects or causes or things like that.
Right.
So not only do we have earmarks coming out of the general fund, we've got earmarks coming out of the payroll tax now. And I'd also just remark at
Right.
some point we have to stop calling it the jumpstart tax, because if the original
Yeah.
notion of that was it was supposed to be sort of jumpstarting Seattle's economic
Mm,
recovery, coming out of the pandemic. Well, kind of not only we passed that in time, but
mm.
just looking at the economic situation now, we don't really seem to be doing that now. So,
Yeah. Right.
it's a payroll
Right.
tax,
Yeah.
and it's a
That's
payroll
what it
tax.
is.
In fact, the payroll tax revenues may be going down in the near future too. So,
Right, right, and we touched on I did wanna get into some of the details here, Kevin, in terms of what you saw here. 487 pages of goodness to go through here, and a difficult task here for sure, but I wanna talk about some of the cuts here because that's what she's talking about. Some of these choices, some of these new programs, as she put it, aren't getting funding, but there's some other intricacies here too. Can you talk about some of the cuts that you were really aware of when you looked through this budget package?
yeah, there's definitely some cuts to the police department budget.
Mhm,
And some of them are just kind of where they deciding to officially put things. So the mayor wanted to move the parking enforcement officers back into SPD instead of keeping them SDOT.
mhm,
The council isn't on board with that, so they've got an amendment in there to keep them in SDOT for now while they go figure out,
mhm.
whether they should go to the new communications center
Yep,
for
CSCC,
911,
right, mhm,
the CSCC.
mhm.
Uh, there's the mayor also wanted to expand the unified care team, which some people I think fairly accurately are describing as kind of the new navigation team in the city, to handle
Yeah,
both outreach and sort of the logistics of cleaning up unsanctioned homeless encampments. The council
mhm.
is cutting that back and moving the outreach dollars over to the King County Regional Homeless Authority, Seattle's sort of
Right.
contribution to their budget. But the Regional Homeless Authority has not been excited about doing outreach on the day of encampment removals.
Right.
So, you
Right.
know, the council can put the money over there, but that doesn't mean it's going to get spent on outreach for that. So I think that
Right.
there's
Okay.
probably going to be a fight down the line there. They cut $1 million that was to go to one of the mayor's pet projects, which is to deploy Shot Spotter
Right.
in several neighborhoods around the city. So they cut that,
For
cut
gunshots.
recruitment and
Right. Mhm.
retention program money for SPD. So a bunch of cuts to SPD. Um, let's see. As you mentioned before, the REIT revenues are coming in low this year. So there's a bunch of cuts to SDOT and parks programs that were funded by REIT. Um, they've
Mhm.
in ads, they've added $4 million to continue supporting the LEAD program. They
Right.
have um, increased the vehicle license fee by $10, and that will hopefully continue to fund some transportation projects that need to happen. There's no other big tax increases in there,
Yeah.
and we'll see what this process isn't done.
Yeah.
By Wednesday this week, the other city council members have one last chance to submit amendments. So it's going to be hard at this point because any amendment they submit has to be self-balancing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very important point here. I did want to talk about one small piece here, a small budget ad, 1 million $1 million this year, and actually $1 million the next going into mental health services for Seattle schools. This comes on the heels of demands from students from Ingram High School, other high schools around our area. They staged a walkout early this week, went to Seattle City Hall to demonstrate after that awful, deadly school shooting at Ingram last week. The money from the city's proposed budget would go into the Department of Education and Early Learning, DEAL, the city department that interacts with the Seattle School District. But this gets complicated really quickly here, Kevin. Put simply, the city is not going to provide nearly the amount of funding these students were asking for more counselors, more safety measures in their schools. What's at play here?
Well, yeah, this is complicated. If you spend some time, tracking Seattle sort of government things, you quickly realize that there's a bit of a disconnect because the Seattle School District is not under the city of Seattle government. It's a completely parallel, separate organization, right? So, and this has been, a frustration for the mayor and for the city council, sort of on an ongoing basis. That sometimes they want things to happen in schools, and they end up sort of passing their own funding for little things to kind of work around the periphery. And this is one of them, right? So, they can't decide what the funding is for or how many teachers are hired or all that stuff. But, can they fund more school buses? Can they fund more mental health services like this? So they want to put a little bit more money in this year, not as much as the students have demanded, but a little bit more. But, all they can do is basically throw money over the wall. And it's really, they can't hire this, the city council and the city of Seattle can't hire mental health counselors to be in schools. That's something that the school district is going to have to do. All they can do is throw money over the wall and hope the school district does what they want with it.
Yeah, briefly on this part, I wonder if this issue might come up again when the city's Families Education Preschool and Promise Levy, the FEP, comes up for renewal 3 years from now. I know that school nurses are part of the FEP. Specific mental health program set in place there. They do talk a lot about mental health supports when people go to the health clinic there at these different schools, these students. I just wonder about that. I really see the FEP and that levy there as another way that the city has tried to influence what's going on in Seattle schools.
Yeah, that will certainly come up again. And another one of these kind of edge cases is preschool, right? So the school district runs the public primary, middle schools, high schools, and the city of Seattle, through its Department of Education and Early Learning, runs preschools.
That's right, the Seattle preschool program.
It's again, city of Seattle not having ownership of the school district, getting frustrated and kind of doing things on their own to try to achieve some of their own goals. It's a very strange dichotomy, and it really doesn't work.
It is. I've noticed that power struggle too between our schools and our city, and very interesting stuff unfolding here. Well, folks, here's the deal. Another public hearing on the budget Tuesday night, the third and final public hearing there, 5 p.m. in council chambers, or you can submit your input online or see it live on Seattle Channel. Make sure you check it out there. We're going to talk about something up next year, election fallout. Some races that were up in the air last week are settling down into cold, hard facts. We're breaking down the details on Now Hear This. Okay, all y'all listening out there, were you surprised by the November election results? You can tell me. It's all right. Well, you're not alone. Here's the deal. Let's put it that way. I had a conversation with Will Casey from The Stranger about this last week. Here's what he said.
Well, I think it's just an indication of how tough it's going to be for Republicans to win statewide at all, unless they significantly sort of rebrand and try to tack, back to the middle. And they've just, as JT Wilcox will tell you, had a hard time enforcing sort of party discipline up and down the ballot. So I think, so long as they're getting clobbered in King County, where there's a large portion of the state
voters
population,
here,
and frankly voters who show up, right? And I think that's going to be a challenge for them going forward.
Well, Kevin, other than it looks like Republicans are going to take a slim majority in the U.S. House, I think there's a lot to what Will is saying here. This red wave did not happen. How did you see that playing out locally and statewide?
Well, yeah. So statewide, one of the things we're hearing now is now that all the votes are being counted, it's kind of going the opposite here that we're seeing a lot of the swing states in the country, where it was predicted a week ago that Democrats are going to pick up a number of seats in both state houses. And now it's actually not looking like it. They're picking up a few, but it wasn't nearly the blue wave that people thought had happened a week ago. But there's a lot of, looking locally and looking, at some of the federal races, it's turned out to be an
Hmm.
interesting blue wave here. So Kim Schreier here in
Right.
the larger King County area has done better than everybody thought that
Hmm.
she would do. Um,
In the
uh,
8th district. Yep.
Lucam
Hmm.
Perez down in the 3rd district has won now against Joe Kent. That was definitely a surprise that flip blue.
Surprise, nationwide
Um,
surprise on that one. Yeah. Hmm.
Nationwide surprise. Yeah. Locally, I think one of the really interesting ones to look at is this whole are we going to change our voting system to ranked choice or approval voting? And while,
Yeah.
that race
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
still a dead heat.
Can we hold on that one for just a second? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, all
Yeah.
right. We'll,
Can,
we'll
can we
hold
hold
on
on
that.
that one
We'll
for a
hold on that
second? I
one for
wanted to
just.
split that one out. Yeah. Please, please. I did want to talk about prosecutor's race. I really saw this as an interesting movement too between uh, maybe the more moderate, even conservative viewpoint that we really saw from Seattle voters, I think, last year in the election, with the election of Ann Davis and Bruce Harrell, for that matter. And that conservatism or moderatism, whatever you want to call it, really didn't seem to play out here with the prosecutors' races. Some thoughts on that one?
Well, yeah. So, I spent a lot of time looking at the demographics of the return ballots
Right,
over the
right.
last week, and kind of watching from, the early days, 2 weeks before the election, all the way up to day of. And just like, we've been hearing about how young voters came out, nationwide in larger numbers. They came out in a little larger numbers here in Seattle. It was a few percentage points
Mm,
higher, but it was sort of equally strong in the rest of King County, if not a little bit stronger. Even it was a couple percentage points more.
hmm.
For looking at what was the percentage of the overall ballots that came from like under 35 voters, it was a little stronger in the rest
Okay.
of King County than it was in Seattle, and maybe that's just because there was already
Hmm.
kind of more younger voters, and Seattle as a whole is already younger. But so I think in some ways that kind of affected the King County prosecutor race and potentially Kim Schreier's race, right?
Mm,
That
I see.
that the rest of King County, we kind of think of like Seattle is a deep blue kind of one big population center in King County, and then the rest is pretty red, particularly as you go,
Mm,
south and east, and
right.
maybe it's a little more purple right now.
Yeah.
That's certainly the
Yeah.
way the
Yeah.
numbers are starting to look.
Right, right. And in terms of how these numbers looked in comparison, because I remember talking with the King County election staff right after the election there and saying, how are our rich numbers looking here? It doesn't look like it was as high as it was in 2020 for certain, which was a big, big year,
Right.
a watershed
Yeah.
year for voting, but it wasn't exactly what King County elections thought it was either. They thought we'd be up and over 72%. I don't think we're going to reach that number. Any other thoughts about just
Yeah.
who showed up and who didn't when it comes to the elections?
Yeah. So it looks like now Seattle's gonna be about 70%, and King
Okay.
County as a whole is gonna be 67, somewhere between 67 and 68%. So
Okay.
yeah, a little short of what they originally predicted. 2 years ago, it was about 88, 89%. So we're way off that mark. And that's really no surprise to anybody that, as opposed to a big
Right.
presidential election where there's a lot on line.
Hmm.
Obviously there's a lot on line this year. And, you could argue democracy and, rights and the economy are all this year. But midterms are never quite as much as the big presidential races. It was certainly a bunch more than last year, right?
Right.
In an odd
Right.
numbered year,
Right.
and that's also to nobody's surprise. So we're kind of in the middle range, but again, about 70% here in Seattle, which is that's a good turnout for a November election here in Seattle.
Hmm.
I mentioned some of the things about there was a little bit more youth turnout this time, a little bit, and it's kind of hard to judge because the overall numbers were up, right? So you're
Yeah.
looking at kind of what's the how did the proportion change? And the proportion
Hmm.
was a little less older voters, 65 and up,
Okay.
a little
Okay.
more under 35, kind of the
Mm,
middle range was about the same middle range of
okay.
ages.
Okay.
Obviously, some of the classic things we expect, like a big sort of youth turnout at the last minute, happened
Right.
again. right?
Yeah, there we go.
The younger voters
Kids
tend to
today, I
vote
tell you.
super, super late. Yeah, kids today.
Mhm.
It was interesting to look at sort of what percentage came in through drop boxes. If you recall, 2 years
Yeah,
ago, we had the whole Louis DeJoy thing where everybody was scared about the
yeah.
post office. So everybody was using drop boxes. It looks like it's gone back to normal again now. A lot of
Okay.
mail-in
Okay.
votes. Still, drop boxes still get a lot of use here, but it's not overwhelming like it was 2 years ago.
Okay. Well, I wanted to break out that one particular election issue that you mentioned minutes ago, ranked choice voting. So on election night, it looked like this basic question of this Seattle measure, should we change our voting system at all, was going to fail. That has changed over the past week. The yes vote is now ahead, and it's actually still too close to call as we record this podcast early in the week. But Kevin, let's say this trend continues here. Voters overwhelmingly said we want ranked choice voting, not approval voting, if we do make a change. Let's say this yes vote does hold up. What is that going to mean?
Well, so it's interesting because ranked choice voting was really designed to be like a replacement not only for for a particular election, but for like one of these primary general election systems, right? Where
Right.
instead of having the primaries sort of narrowing down to like two candidates and then and having or one from each party and then having a general election, you just do one. And you get to vote for a number of different candidates, and it gets whittled down until the candidate with the broadest support sort of gets a thing. So, but what
Right.
they're proposing here for us is that we would do ranked choice voting for just the primary, right, and use that to whittle it down to the top two candidates, right,
Right.
and
Right.
in part that's because the elections they would be doing this for are nonpartisan. So it wouldn't be like
Right.
there was a socialist candidate, there's a Democratic candidate, there'd be a Republican candidate. It's like whichever two
Right.
candidates,
Right.
and it could be two Republicans, it could be two Democrats, could be two socialists.
Sure.
Whichever two get the highest number of votes are the ones that would move on. And so that's a bit weird just to kind of start with that. But you could also say that's probably a good thing though, because we've seen in some of our races, like with the mayor's race last time, we can start with 10, 20 candidates, right? And with 20 candidates, you try to have, as you know,
Yeah.
from
Right.
hosting a number of candidate forums, you can't have a candidate forum with 20 candidates, right? Everybody gets 2 minutes
Right.
at the end. It still takes an hour and a half.
No,
And at the end
it
of it,
doesn't
you
work.
don't really know anything more about anybody about this. So
Right.
to be able to narrow it down in a primary to two,
Yeah.
and then actually have a conversation with those two through the general election cycle, could be a lot better, right? So
Yeah.
that's what
Yeah.
we're going to be struggling
I
with.
think so
What's the
too.
right way to make.
Yeah.
So I guess the other thing I throw out there is that the conventional wisdom is that
And I think
ranked
too,
choice
struggling
voting.
with it over the next. Yeah, please.
The conventional wisdom is that ranked choice voting favors candidates with broader appeal, and that most often translates into more moderate and centrist candidates. So, is ranked choice voting going to push Seattle towards more moderate elected officials? Could that be trouble for somebody like Councilmember Swan? Right. Well, it's not going to get implemented in time for next year. So the 2023, if Swan decides to run again, it won't matter for that. But probably sort of the one after that, it will matter for, if assuming we do in fact enact ranked choice voting.
Right. And a good observation, because it sounds like 2027 would be the first year that ranked choice voting would actually go into effect. I will say also King County is working on this. They might introduce some legislation next year to talk about ranked choice voting on a county level. Also, the state has been working on this for the past 7 years. They've had this local options bill where different jurisdictions can actually make these choices to hold a different type of election, like ranked choice voting, etc. On the flip side of that, I should also point out Clark County, San Juan County had ranked choice voting on the ballot, and overwhelmingly in both cases, 57% plus of the voters said no on that. So a lot going on with this piece. And Kevin, I appreciate your back and forth on this, because it could be something very confusing to voters. I know what, so we're going to keep an eye on that one for sure. But I wanted to talk about something coming up here. So remember when your mom told you those video games are going to rot your brain? Well, now I say that to my kids, so that's very accurate. But Kevin wrote a very interesting piece on this in the South Seattle Emerald. It's our podcast gem of the week. I blame most problems I have in my life to my constant connection to my Atari 2600 when I was a kid after playing Combat I dreamed of the day I could chase after another person in a maze, riding a tank, and take out their tank by bouncing it off of 3 different walls. So there's the proof that my brain is definitely rotted out here. But in all seriousness, you wrote a story in the South Seattle Emerald that's actually based on a real study to look into this question. Tell us about what you found, this relationship between video games and kids. People talk about it a lot. What's going on?
Oh yeah, this has been a raging debate since you and I were kids. Like, do video games rot kids'
Yeah,
brains? And you know, and of
yeah,
course, it's important to put a historical context on that, right? Before we said that about video games, we said that about TV. We said that about radio when
mm,
radio was first introduced. Like, oh no, people should be reading
sure.
books. You don't want to read radio. And even
Hmm,
when
hmm.
books were introduced, there were people who said, adults who said, "Nah, it's going to rot kids' brains," right? Um,
Yeah,
so there's a long and glorious history of these kinds of questions, like, oh my God, is this going to be bad for kids, right? So, but
sure.
a little while back, a group of researchers got funding to create this thing called the ABCD study, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive
Hmm.
Development Study, where they're collecting
Okay.
data. They've enrolled several thousand children, and starting at age 9 and 10, and they are giving them sort of creating a database for them, including sort of a battery of different kind of mental tests, demographic information, and they're
Hmm.
doing MRIs on them, so they can actually take a look at how their brains sort of are developing over time, and they can sort of keep going back and collecting more data over time as they go through their adolescence and kind of see what happens to them. Now, this is another one of these great sort of, you know, treasure chests of data that you can use to do a whole lot of different kinds of studies on this. So there's a set of researchers from University of Vermont who
Hmm.
pulled a sample out of this ABCD study to look at based on, like, which of the kids play video games and which don't, and what difference do we see from that? And
Yep.
they found on at least, a few of the cognitive measures of sort of their ability to get tasks done, and their hand-eye coordination and respond to commands and things like that, the gamers had more developed skills, right? But they also found,
Right.
sort of on the behavioral side, that they had higher levels of attention deficit disorder, aggressive behavior, depression. So it's kind of a mix of those.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to jump in here, the whole challenge with this, and I know you love your data, and you were about to bring this up, and I can see your wheels moving there. That whole idea of, does the video game actually cause, or is it just a correlation? That's still a difficult question
Yeah.
here, I think.
Yeah, that's always a tough question with research studies is, is one causing the other? But the nice thing about this being kind of a long-term study is they can probably figure
Mm,
out some of this, because, some of the kids who at the baseline at the start of this aren't playing video games will start playing video games
mm,
over their adolescence,
okay.
right? And so then as that happens, they can say, okay, well, compared to the ones who don't play video games now and don't start playing video games, do their cognitive skills develop? And or do they develop more mental health issues? Or, is it the flip side? Is it that people with naturally more developed cognitive skills get attracted to video games because they're better at them, right? Or is there something about video games such that people who
Mm,
may be more inclined to behavioral issues get drawn into them, right? That they give them, some particular kind of
wow.
feedback
Yeah.
that is positive for them. So this again, the benefit of long-term study is they can look at that, because once they see, like, yeah, if you just take a snapshot in time, it's harder to develop the causality. But if you watch over time, you can see, like, okay, they start playing video games and then these other things start happening.
Right, right. I know this is a study that my mom would have signed me up for when I was a kid. I'm fascinated to learn how this one turns out over time here. It is time to wrap up here, Kevin, but I did want to ask you, as we talked a little bit about COVID shot last week, and that was a big deal. You did a little work in looking into the flu numbers that are really concerning this year, and I just wanted to pass that along. Some data there that's not too good from a health standpoint.
Yeah, it's just we're right at the beginning still of the flu season, and
Hmm.
it's starting to pick up, and it's picking up faster than on an average year, right? And so, as we talked about before,
Mm,
the worry is because we all hid for the last 2 years because of COVID. Normally from year to year,
Put
people carry
masks
over a
and
little bit of a little bit of immunity from the flu from last year. So flu does this really interesting thing. Influenza bounces between the northern and southern hemisphere, right? So because it's really a winter kind of virus that people get, and it evolves a little bit with every step. So the flu shot that we're getting now is based upon the flu they saw in the southern hemisphere 6 months ago, right? And the flu that the folks in Australia are going to be getting 6 months from now is based upon what they actually see for flu here right now, right? So there's this constant slow evolution of flu that happens as it bounces back and forth between the northern and southern hemisphere, right? And we're always trailing it a little bit, but not too bad. But what they're and partly that's okay because we still carry over a little bit of immunity from the last time we had flu. But what people are worried about is because we've all been hiding for the last 2 years, the number of cases of flu last 2 years has been super low. And so they're worried that there's no kind of just general immunity left to flu because nobody's seen it for 2 years. So they're expecting this could be a really, really bad flu year because nobody's carrying around immunity right now. So go get a flu shot. Great year to go get a flu shot.
Right. Absolutely. And that's the bottom line I keep saying to folks too. Get that flu shot. Make sure you get that COVID booster too, and stay well, everybody. And Kevin, you well too. Thank you as always for joining me here on Seattle News, Views and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on all the major platforms. Look for Views and Brews on Patreon too to show your support for the show. Thanks for watching on Converge Media too. Next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2020.